Most people, when they discover the cooperative movement for the first time, ask, why aren't there more co-ops in the United States? If cooperatives and mutualism solve so many of the problems in our workplaces and in the economy and possibly society in general, why isn't there a stronger cooperative movement today? Then they ask, was it more popular at some point? If it was, what happened? And how did this all begin? They might ask, what the heck is a movement anyway? Who is inside of it and outside of it? Is it one movement or several? How did it help in the past and how can it help today? You can't learn co-op history without gaining an appreciation for study groups. It's almost like the core of how this movement operates. Learning alone is brutal, and learning together is probably the only way to learn cooperation. More often than not, co-op study groups turn into steering committees, which turn into startups. Potlucks and world cafes can even bring together entire communities to start projects on a bigger scale. History shows us that this is how one person with a couple of their friends can push back against overwhelming forces and create their own space. If you were organizing a study group, you might read a book about cooperatives together. You might tour a local co-op together. You might bring in guest speakers or hop on a video call with a co-op professional. That's exactly what we're going to do today. Welcome to our study group on co-op movements. But first, who are we anyway? I'm Stephen Shelto, a co-op coach in South Carolina, and this is Alex Stone, the director of CooperationWorks, a network of skilled co-op organizers and educators from across the United States. Several months ago, we had the idea to capture different perspectives on the past, present, and future of co-op movements in a format appropriate for a study group. We hope you'll consider checking out the books and resources mentioned in these conversations, or maybe visit some of the co-ops we feature yourself. Our network sent us way more footage than we could possibly fit in one video, so I'm going to do my best to summarize their presentations and some highlights from our conversations. Conversations like this.
I think if you Googled history of cooperatives, probably one of the top hits would be something about the Rochdale principles and the history of the creation of the 7 or 6 cooperative principles that eventually became 7, which internationally are known as the Rochdale cooperative principles. I think that probably would be one of the top hits. I think there are problems with it, and not in a way of an academic like this is problematic just because and then it's an academic argument. I think it's slightly problematic because we're centering one particular experience, so white men writing the history or becoming the center of the stories of history.
Well, here's the thing though. They were innovative.
Yeah.
I do think it gets tricky. I understand and support the pushback against like this idea that the Rochdale pioneers were the first to have a cooperative. That's not true. There were the Fenwick Weavers. Like, absolutely, they're not the first. They didn't invent cooperation. They did make some adjustments to the model. So, like dividends, for instance, and like codifying one member, one vote. It was kind of that they had that codification, I guess.
I think it's just one story, an important one because there's so many echoes from that experience to now. We're talking about the Industrial Revolution that this cooperative was born out of, that artisans were being displaced by mechanization, by automation, by new technology. And so they needed to come together to build something, a grocery store, to serve their community. There are a lot of echoes to now, to automation, artificial intelligence, and that it's impacting a certain segment of the population that has a lot more political power. And so people are getting scared now because these technologies are automating and displacing workers who have typically been protected from that type of automation or mechanization.
From a marketing standpoint, for getting someone excited about cooperatives, the one pitch is, hey, in the 40s, these folks came up with a great idea and we've been doing it ever since and it's still good. That's one thing.
Uh-huh.
But I feel like Don Draper would get in there and say, well, this is just innate to being a person. So to tell the story that we're going back to something rather than like we invented yet another thing to make life more complicated during the Industrial Revolution is just a good pitch, I think. Look how long we've been doing these things in every culture. But like when you watch your friends' kids, these are cooperative economics. That's what we're excited about. It's not we're not just a bunch of like bylaw nerds.
Yeah.
I don't think it's about like minimizing their impact on the cooperative movement. I think it is about like uplifting all of these stories that like African American cooperation have been hidden. Hopefully no one's pissed off about that.
Well, I mean, a brave study group wades into challenging topics, so I think we're off to a good start. There's probably no better guide for talking about Indigenous and African American roots of cooperation than Jessica Gordon Nembard, author of Collective Courage, A History of African American Cooperative Economic Thought and Practice. A history which, until Jessica published her groundbreaking research in 2014, was often ignored. Because land acknowledgements are a traditional practice that dates back centuries, that feels like a natural way to begin.
I want to start with a land and ancestor acknowledgement. So I want to acknowledge the original stewards of the land wherever we are, especially those of us under settler colonialism. I want to acknowledge our elders. I also want to acknowledge the African origins of all humanity and acknowledge the struggles of the ancestors, enslaved laborers, all those who continue to labor without just compensation, all those combating anti-Blackness, combating patriarchy. I want to acknowledge our claim to land and resources and to a healthy planet. And I want to acknowledge our histories of resistance and using cooperatives for liberation. So we actually know now that mutuality, solidarity, cooperation are all universal. They've been utilized by all populations in every era of human history, on every continent. There's notions of the common good, the commonwealth, the commons, collectivism. And we know that early African civilizations, First Nations, indigenous cooperative efforts. In fact, I often now talk about cooperatives as the first economic system rather than an alternative economic system. It's alternative to capitalism right now, but it was really humanity's first economic system. This history that I was able to chronicle really shows that both freed and enslaved African Americans shared resources. They had kitchen gardens. They pooled money to buy their own and their family members' freedom. They started independent schools and communes, intentional communities where they were able to farm and work together. They created mutual aid societies to support each other when they were in need. The Underground Railroad can be seen as an economic and social solidarity system, right? It's a movement of people out of enslavement, sharing resources from a wagon to food to a place to live to the root, and all needed access to capital and financial services that were not predatory or discriminatory, and so created credit exchanges and credit unions once there was credit union law. African Americans have resisted enslavement and oppression to fight for their own freedom, and economic cooperation is part of that. We've pursued economic alternatives for survival and resistance, and using these co-op alternatives, we have been able to move toward independence and liberation on some levels. Obviously, we haven't achieved all that yet. Many of the players in the Black co-op movement are the same as those famous in the civil rights activities, and some of the strongest Black organizations throughout our history also promoted co-op education, co-op development. Many of the co-ops that were targeted by white supremacist violence were, if they were supported by their communities, they were able to survive. Sometimes the communities gave money, they increased their participation as customers, and often they put themselves on the line physically to protect and defend the co-ops. What are some of the lessons learned? The first one I didn't really talk about much is the importance of education, study groups, and training. We know that I know from my research that most of the co-ops that I found anything about how they started with some kind of study group, people coming together to learn together and then learn about the co-op model together and then continuously learning. And so those things we find are really important and stick with us when we think about the legacies.
Yeah, well, I think that really speaks to this idea of cooperation as the first form of economics, right? It highlights that people have always relied on economic cooperation. And today we have these legal frameworks, we have the cooperative principles that serve to formalize cooperative practices and entities. And in some ways, that's great. It helps everyone have a better understanding, better definition of what a cooperative is. But it's also important to recognize that these broader, deeper, and less formalized methods of cooperation exist that people have engaged in essentially forever. And these communal towns and mutual aid societies are examples of these less formalized forms of cooperation.
I've heard Jessica say in other interviews that she's been told, especially doing her research, that Black people don't do co-ops. That before she dug into it, it was viewed as something for like hippies in suits. But I think that's changed a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I think that she uncovered, again, this hidden history of African American cooperation. And I also recall from some of her interviews that when she would talk to some people, they wouldn't necessarily think that they had a connection to cooperatives. But once they actually started engaging in conversation, they would remember something about a grandparent or a parent or aunt who like had been a part of a consumer co-op or some kind of mutual aid society. And once they were actually prompted to think about it, they recognized that they did even have like close personal family connections to cooperatives or cooperation.
One of the first things that comes to mind for me is that I need to remember that alternative economics has at times been dangerous. You know, the Black community buying from white owned businesses and that creating this kind of fear that that business would be lost.
Yeah, I think in line with that, when you see cooperative structures really actually challenging the powers that be, you see like power defend itself, kind of when cooperatives are working the most. And I really appreciate your emphasis on the importance of having a co-op in your community that people can actually point to, can experience. And when we hear from the folks at Co-op Dayton, we'll actually learn just how important a grocery cooperative in their community has been for really inspiring the community toward cooperative action in a broader way.
Seeing is believing. Any good study group should go on the road at some point. We're going to take you to Co-op Dayton in Ohio, where Sherelle Gardner and Amaha Selassie are building something more than just a co-op. Since we're kind of pretending that we're in a little virtual study group together, I want to try to bring together some of the folks we've met so far and simulate what it would be like to be a fly on the wall and listen in on some of the conversations you'd hear between co-op organizers during a tour. Bonus tip, it's always a good idea to ask your hosts what inspired you to try to do something different.
I think Dr. Nemhart's book, Collective Courage, is almost like a sacred text.
Yeah.
It's
I think that's our informal orientation manual. All of our staff starts with a copy of Collective Courage. And we can't have a conversation until you read it.
In movement work, oftentimes, some people, they want to focus on economic development, and some people want to work on just like social or something like that. And she makes this argument that like actually they were all tied together. It was intentionally kind of separated to keep us from like realizing, our power and potential.
Yeah, I think that those two approaches really highlight the difference between type 1 and type 2 cooperatives, which is a whole can of worms we won't get into in too much detail here. Generally, type 1 co-ops are motivated by economic justice, whereas type 2 co-ops tend to have a social justice motivation. And these aren't mutually exclusive. Your co-op can be motivated by both of those. Your co-op movement could be motivated by both. One can follow the other, but it is interesting to reflect that this difference is seen in two of the movements we've heard about today.
I think the like soft story that I tell myself is that there was this bifurcation, this separation of what are we trying to build towards, this future that we want, and versus, or on the other side of the spectrum, the fight against. There's all these terrible things, and we need to fight for the material conditions and the well-beings of our community, and that means we need to stop things from happening. And so at some point, these two kind of ideologies or camps became separated because they started critiquing each other. And I think right now it's exciting because it's coming back, and we're seeing the interdependence of both of these fight, like build towards or build for and fight against, is that at some point people in these movement spaces started seeing a waste of resources going towards one or the other side. And so they started critiquing each other, and it became an internal critique within movement spaces of, why are you trying to build this co-op? We need to advocate for these tenants to be able to stay housed. And the other side saying, we need to build these institutions so these tenants don't have to keep having the same fight. They'll have stability.
If we're going to ask politicians to support new programs, new policies, we also have to be organizing ourselves to build the type of world and infrastructure that we know we need to survive and thrive.
Yeah. I remember when we opened up the market, people cried, and I didn't understand why. And like, it happened once or twice, and I didn't think much of it, but like people just kept crying when they came in there, and like, I still don't fully understand it, but I think it was just something that, like, sometimes like we accept the unacceptable, and it's something like, like we actually did this, like, and the hope that gets generated when people believe that they can like change their lived environment, We probably should say what Gem City Market is. So, the Gem City Market is a full service grocery store that is community owned and will be worker owned.
Because of that market, we were able to find artists, we were able to find like birth workers and doulas, aspiring farmers. On a typical Tuesday, you might walk in, and in the teaching kitchen, there's a class being taught by a community member. As you go through the produce aisle, you'll see one of our newest worker co-ops, Guided by Mushrooms, and all of their gourmet mushrooms right when you walk in. You'll go back to the back of the store in the community room with Tribe, a collective of birth workers and healers and doulas, doing Mamas at the Market programming. And as you come around the corner towards the front of the store, you'll see handmade and homemade goods from local artisans who the makerspace is organizing to make sure they have access to the tools and equipment they need to thrive in their careers. And so Gem City Market was an idea, but it organized people and allowed them to bring out their gifts and talents and really imagine, like, what do we need as a community? What do I need as an individual? And how do we organize ourselves to make those things happen?
The community, we did a survey, and the community came back that they wanted a grocery store. And so then, we set about to meet that need, which ended up being the Gem City Market. And so through the process of emerging the Gem City Market, we transformed recipients into co-creators, right? Because we were highly participatory through our process, from, our mission statement, from naming the market, from our architecture. We did a community process of co-creation.
And people can name what they did. Like, it doesn't feel like so detached from your own actions and own beliefs. Like, when you go into GCM, people can walk by the beer and wine case and be like, I made that happen because I voted at the annual meeting that brought that here. Or I voted and I didn't want to hear. But that you were a part of it. And I think that so often, I don't think we have a lot of examples in our lives and in our communities where we can like touch something and feel something and see something and say, I did that.
Yeah. Especially together.
Yeah, together.
Yeah.
When we think of it as a movement, it's what are we trying to do to move society forward, and what are the different mechanisms that we're using to do that. And I see in the United States a lot of cooperatives trying to do that intentionally.
Co-op Dayton isn't the only group doing movement building and community education and bringing together lots of different businesses. The Industrial Commons in Western North Carolina is another example. These ambitious projects are fueled by networking building high trust relationships. Amaha and Terrell are making sure they aren't just creating a siloed community, but that their members are aware of and participating in national and regional and even global efforts.
In general, the market is a catalyst for a more beloved community. You know, like how do we have this, that third space, right? Like how do we have this, we have your work, your home, and then we're more in the market, but a movement, And so to me, like the more we're living into cooperative principles and we're showing these tangible things, is like an alternative is possible. I was remiss not to mention industrial commons because that was, I had a chance to visit, and that was what showed me that it actually is possible, that we're not just talking, it really can happen. I'm also thankful for Co-op Cincy. Like when we first started, Co-op Cincy were our guides. We went to them for everything, at first, and then we expanded out from there. But they provided so much help, and I think that's part of cooperative principle. Like that P6, that cooperatives help cooperatives, because FCI has done a lot for us. Food Co-op Initiative. It's I just appreciate, CooperationWorks has helped us out. It's I appreciate how, people are willing to share resources, share ideas. We'll hop on a call for an hour when you're trying to figure out a problem, or you want to you talk about the future. Everybody the way that we cooperate amongst each other is so critical. And it reminds me of something in Dr. Nemhart's book, where she talks about am I someone that people can cooperate with? And that is the thing that just always sticks with me.
Cooperatives and food are deeply intertwined, especially in the United States. It's a survival need, so it isn't too surprising that what often prompts people to set up collaborative agreements is the need for reliable food sources. To begin learning the complicated history of agricultural cooperatives, we asked Bruce Reynolds, an economist who worked at the USDA for nearly 40 years, for a summary. That's quite a challenge, because farming co-ops have been around for a long time and have directly impacted every other co-op sector, and continue to impact how food arrives at the grocery store. But we can focus on one theme.
There's an interplay in agricultural history between oppressive business practices and the reaction of farmers by organizing cooperatives. This interplay continues often with efforts by non-cooperative businesses to diminish the influence and the role of farmer cooperatives in the economy. As branch lines off of the main transcontinental routes developed, settlements expanded rapidly. Unfortunately, the railroad companies and agribusinesses were charging very high prices for farm services and paying low prices for farm products. The Grange was a farmer movement that started organizing local cooperatives to improve the economic lot of farmers. They eventually turned their attention to regulation of the railroads that was eventually successful. The effort to coordinate large volumes of farmer products on prices, as the Farmers Alliance had tried to do, was attempted at other times too in the early 20th century, and it brought about prosecution of these groups on antitrust grounds. So in 1922, the Congress passed the Capper-Volstead Act, which gave cooperatives limited immunity from antitrust if they adhered to three conditions. They had to not handle non-member volume that was larger than member volume. They had to adhere to one member, one vote governance. And they also couldn't pay in excess of 8% on patronage dividends or on equity that was redeemed to members. Early in the 20th century, new farm organizations became involved with cooperative development. There was the National Farmers Union and the Farm Bureau. Land-grant universities were also offering cooperative education. The University of Wisconsin recently pointed out courses on cooperatives as early as 1910. My former agency in the U.S. Department of Agriculture was established in 1926 to assist cooperatives and to collect farmer cooperative statistics. Farmer cooperatives grew from 3,099 in 1913 to 12,000 by 1929. This number gradually decreased after 1929 with mergers of cooperative organizations. But the critical thing was that business volume for cooperatives has, for the most part, steadily increased over time up to the present. Cooperatives have also had an influence on the way businesses can be formed and taxed. Businesses, non-cooperative, investor-owned businesses, particularly in the petroleum industry, were very critical of Subchapter T. They viewed cooperatives as having single tax status while they had double taxation, the tax at the firm level and taxation to their investors. So they organized the Tax Equality Association, which lobbied for the repeal of Subchapter T, and they held many hearings on Capitol Hill. But after a couple decades, the National Tax Equality Association ceased to exist. These investor-owned businesses determined that a better strategy was to establish their own single tax systems, which they did with the limited liability companies. But LLCs have been useful. They facilitate startup businesses, and there are many groups who operate as cooperatives but are established as LLCs. The Black Farmers Cooperative movement did not really emerge until after World War II. Black farmers incurred discrimination in access to services, but the main catalyst was the taking of farmland that these black farmers owned. Two developments after World War II created incentives for white farmers to take back farmland that had been deeded to black farmers by an earlier generation. First were the new cotton varieties that came in after World War II. These cotton varieties, the cotton bolls, would mature in a very narrow time frame. In the traditional cotton crop, different cotton bolls would mature over about a 3-month harvest period. With these new varieties, mechanization of cotton harvesting was feasible, and this greatly reduced the need for farm labor, and it also enabled cotton growers to farm more land. White farmers were able to take back the land from black farmers by limiting their access to crop financing and also limiting their participation in the price support program. These programs were administered locally without control or oversight by headquarters of USDA in Washington, D.C. In the 1960s, the Federation of Southern Cooperatives was formed to help organize cooperatives. And in 1971, the Emergency Land Fund was created to help black farmers maintain their ownership of farmland. These and many other collective efforts arose to counter extreme discrimination in the seizure of land. Their story aptly demonstrates the workings of cooperative principles, and more salient than most other histories, theirs is a story about concern for community.
So I think looking at what Bruce has shared, we can really see, even in the ag co-op movement, that there's this push-pull between co-ops making headway, really gaining a market advantage, really having an impact that benefits the lives of their members. And then you see sort of this pushback. And as we get into African-American agricultural cooperatives, we see that push-pull, but then we also have this added element of systemic racism that makes it even harder for these cooperatives to maintain success and to thrive in the long term. So I think what we want to hit on with the importance of Capra-Volstead is, we've already talked a little bit about, like, there was this aggregation of power. So then cooperatives, farmers came together to form cooperatives so that they could have more control over the prices that they got for their products. And they were actually so successful at doing that then you start to get these antitrust laws. I think this was in John Curl's book. It's been a long time, and that's a very dense book. But I think at least some of the antitrust laws were specifically because cooperatives were so successful. And they were like, whoa, 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 you can't do this. You're like, you guys have too much power over us. And that is important. I think there's like a lot of times throughout history where the law has not been on the side of labor, on the side of producers, on the side of cooperatives. And this was actually a really strong instance, both where they were and where they put guardrails on to make sure that that wouldn't get watered down by people or corporations with different interests. We still see examples of how important it is for cooperatives to be involved in policy and legislation. Every state across the US has statutes that govern the incorporation of cooperatives, and those are still in flux. They're still changing. In California, where I live, we had a worker cooperative statute added in 2017.
Local, like cities and municipalities, were saying, what's a worker co-op? There's no legal definition. We can't give money to something that has no definition. And so we created an entity at the state level in California to define what a worker co-op is. And so then we were able to use that state level definition in local and regional policy advocacy to say, this is what a worker co-op is. Here's, this is an entity, but you don't have to just fund this type of entity. You can use the principles and use the criteria that's laid out in this entity to define what a worker co-op is that you are going to support the creation of at the local level. A lot of the strength of cooperatives in the past have come through communities organizing and finding the cooperative as a tool to come together and to build something that the conventional marketplace will not meet their needs, will not meet their demands. So, for example, electrical cooperatives there was funding there from the federal government during, I believe in the Great Depression and World War II. So a lot of those electrical cooperatives, I believe, were started through communities organizing, but also federal subsidies. Similarly with housing cooperatives received a lot of funding through HUD, Housing and Urban Development, during the Great Depression, World War II, and shortly thereafter. And what we saw from that period is that there was this influx of funding that allowed these cooperatives to be established, but there wasn't ongoing federal, state, or local funding for these cooperatives to engage their members in the democratic practices and maintain these cooperatives as democratic institutions, member-led institutions. And so over the years, that part of the cooperatives atrophied.
We've talked about what modern ecosystems are trying to do, and we've talked a lot about the past. But now it's time to talk about the future. And our study group doesn't have to stay inside, so let's go on a walk with Ricardo.
Today I'm in Iguazio, Michoacan in Mexico, and I'm between two pyramids. I'll be talking about the future of cooperatives for CooperationWorks Equity Hub. And you might be wondering why I'm between two pyramids, an ancestral site of the Purépechan people. And it's because part of what I see with the future of cooperatives is that what a lot of people are doing, what a lot of organizations and collectives and groups are doing in the cooperative space is infusing ancestral ways of knowing. One of those being that I'm between the pyramid of the sun and the pyramid of the moon. And they're both built equally high. And that's because they valued women and men equally, and that they saw them both as powerful beings. And so what I see with cooperatives is that people are bringing in those ancestral ways of knowing, those ancestral ways of healing into our movement spaces and into the cooperatives that they're building. And so as I talk about the future of cooperatives, I just want to keep that in mind, that the future of cooperatives isn't about leaving behind the past. It's actually about connecting to the past and to our roots so that we can connect to ourselves and respond to climate change and systems of oppression, while also giving ourselves meaningful livelihoods and the ability to house ourselves and produce and take care of ourselves in our communities. the forest. I love the forest. It's rich in connection and diversity and in networks. And when we're thinking about the future of cooperatives, we need to be thinking about the future of work and the future of the digital economy. How are these connections impacting real people? How have Lyft and Uber impacted industries? They've pushed workers into precarious positions. How has companies like Amazon created digital fiefdoms where people have to go to this one place and sell through one platform and pay rent to one owner? The digital economy is not forgotten on cooperatives and the cooperative community. And so the cooperative community is organizing and getting together and creating alternatives. I'll explain a few of these alternatives in a second, but it's been amazing to see people coming together to develop innovative solutions. Companies that we hadn't even dreamed could exist just a few years ago are starting to become real. And organizations who typically don't do cooperative development are stepping into the gap to fill that void. Immigrant-owned cooperatives. It's a growing segment of the cooperative community, and it will continue to grow. Immigrants have been using cooperatives as a way to build stability, build wealth, and build power. And these cooperatives are being created in industries that rely on the hyper-exploitation of workers to be profitable. And so what we're seeing is that not only are organizations trying to figure out how to continue to build immigrant-owned cooperatives, but also how to scale them. And so we're seeing innovations like the Democracy at Work Institute's rapid response cooperatives that are out of the box, ready cooperatives, that they are partnering with institutions and organizations to allow for a more rapid growth and expansion of immigrant-owned cooperatives. We're also seeing innovations with developers that have a long track record of successful worker cooperative development, like the Center for Family Life in New York, looking at their cooperative development model and the energy that it takes to put into the development of just one cooperative at a time. And so they had a deep development strategy process where they created a new franchise model, looking at the Mondragon cooperatives in Spain and the Arizmendi Association cooperatives in the San Francisco Bay Area, and what they could learn from both. And so what we're going to see moving forward in this future of cooperatives is a larger segment of immigrant-owned cooperatives and cooperatives that are looking towards our most marginalized communities and supporting them with empowerment, power, stability, and wealth creation. The cooperative community is also looking to political power. How can we organize our communities to access the funds that are already captured by the government? And so the cooperative communities are working together in coalition to start to advocate for more pro-cooperative policies. We saw this with the Main Street Employee Ownership Act, where the National Cooperative Business Association with the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives and a host of other organizations went and advocated to the federal government to support the expansion of the cooperative sector. We saw it in California with the passage of the California Worker Cooperative Corporation Act to allow for the growth and create incentives for and a definition of what a worker cooperative is. And we saw it as well at the local level. For example, in Berkeley, in Oakland, in Minneapolis, in Austin, Texas, we've seen either symbolic gestures of government to support cooperatives or actually funding the development of cooperatives. And so as we're looking towards the future and thinking about where are the growth edges for our community, we're seeing political power as one of those points of intervention for the cooperative community.
It can be really overwhelming to think about the amount of work it will take to bring together lots of different industries, diverse populations, navigate different laws in 50 different states. So let's take a breath and start to think through some practical ways that we can move these things forward.
I think one of the things that we haven't done so well in the United States is integrate the different cooperative sectors in a way that builds us as a sort of integrated community. But I think we're strongest when we're working together with other social justice or other types of movements. So if we're looking at housing, one of the things that we've seen in the United States that's different than I think some of the other cooperative communities around the world is that in the United States, the cooperative community is a lot more integrated with other movements. As a whole, we might not be a movement of like all thinking agricultural cooperatives, credit unions, housing co-ops, worker co-ops, producer, all the different sectors. We're not maybe a movement together, but I think within those different areas, there's moments of movements.
It's also really important to think about what they have in common. And at the root of all of this is a desire for self-determination, for communities to be empowered and to empower themselves, and to really at their core have their economic and social needs met.
And what we're also seeing is that other movements have seen cooperatives as a tool for community empowerment. So the movement for Black Lives, writing into their policy platform that one of the things that they see as part of their economic platform is the funding of cooperatives, whether it's housing cooperatives, worker co-ops, grocery co-ops. We need to think about what's contestable. If everybody's holding different types of power, where are sites of contestable power? Where are places that we can put our energy and actually shift the conversation or shift some energy for something to change? And I think that the different cooperative sectors are sites of contestable power. And so that we can go in, and because we have at least a baseline of shared principles and shared values, that they're operating off of a different set of principles than a typical capitalist business of just maximizing shareholder value, that we can at least start to have a conversation. If we need to engage with financial institutions, why don't we engage with the credit union? If we need to try to build more awareness around something, and there are lots of members of an electrical cooperative, let's engage with the electrical cooperative to get the news out or the information to their members, since there's some relationship there. And so who is sort of maybe not your core, but right outside of that core constituency that you're working with to try to bring in. And so that's how I see the cooperative sectors, is they're sort of, even the ones who are not aligned with maybe what I'm trying to do, they still have something in common, that we have a shared language to understand each other, even if our objectives are different, coming from different cultural contexts, or we're just trying to do different things. I'm seeing more connections between housing justice advocates who are in conventional sort of housing justice organizations advocating for tenants' rights, and through the COVID pandemic, advocating for support, subsidies, and a moratorium on evictions, seeing community land trusts and housing cooperatives as tools for them to incorporate into their work, and to educate their members on these models as things for them to be thinking about.
It's really interesting because just as I was editing this video, I listened to a major podcast and an episode on poverty with a call to action all about housing co-ops. That is not a mainstream conversation you would have heard even 5 years ago.
The nonprofit industrial complex has really started to support cooperatives as a tool to respond to economic injustice, racial injustice, workplace injustice. And so now that that's being more resourced, at the same time that we're coming back to this, we need to build bridges between people fighting against things and people building things, building a bridge between those two camps, that the people in the fight against communities or organizations are seeing the benefit of reintegrating and at least starting the dialogue between the organizations doing both of those types of work. So that's some of the story that I tell myself, but I'm sure other people can tell other stories and critique what I just said, which I'm happy about because it is an evolving sort of understanding of where we're at. Yeah, that's how I'd respond to that.
One last question was lingering in the back of my mind, and I just had to ask someone. It feels like anyone discussing co-op history would notice the stagnation or lack of really big growth spots in cooperative movements in the 1980s and the 90s. I mean, we got to lean into the hard conversations, right?
I think for many years, the cooperative development community and cooperatives in general, the cooperative community in general, was very worried about failure, incredibly worried about failure. And the reason that, and it wasn't a misguided worry, it was if there was any time that one cooperative failed, everybody would say, look, cooperatives don't work. Cooperatives in general just don't work because of this one failure over here, because the cooperative sector, cooperative economy was seen as small, particularly in housing cooperatives, in worker co-ops, grocery cooperatives. There were enough of those examples that other people who you would think would be supportive of cooperatives said, we don't believe in co-ops because this one co-op over here failed. And so for a long time, I think people were very worried about failure. And so that became part of the culture of being sort of timid and being humble, but in a way that I think other people perceived as weakness. So I think there's that part. And I think a lot of those folks who are coming out of that experience were participating in cooperatives in the 80s and 90s. And so and at least in my experience, I've seen that part of the culture being exhibited by folks from that era. But I think right now what I'm seeing and what I'm really hopeful about is that we are learning from other movement spaces. We're learning from folks like at the New Economy Coalition, from writers like Adrienne Maree Brown or Grace Lee Boggs, of how should we think about movements? How should we think about leaders? How do we reconceptualize the idea of leader so that we recognize we're the leaders we're looking for?
When we ground ourselves in a world that is interdependent, right? Or like an African philosophy, it would be Ubuntu, that I am because you are, and that we realize our humanity in the presence of other humanity. Then from there, like cooperation is like a natural step, right? Because if we're all connected and we all like King would call single garment of destiny, then what is this future that we're creating together, that we're going to be sharing regardless if we cooperate or not? And that's why I think it's so important in the cooperative movement to be rooted in love and to be naming it. Love is a natural outcome of interdependence as well, or the need to have grace and to build these deep relationships and deep connections amongst each other instead of being transactional. I used to try to build like cooperation or help emerge cooperation, but now it's like what about me is hindering cooperation? That keeps the power within me of like how can I continue to evolve and transform and heal from trauma or whatever is necessary, right? To be someone that people won't hesitate to cooperate with.
I just keep coming back to Jessica's statement that cooperation was the first economic model. And I think as we look forward to the future of the cooperative movement, it's really important to keep that innateness in mind and to find ways to tap into what I really do think is a universal drive to cooperate with one another.
And when you think about it that way, it allows for cooperatives to be leaderful organizations, to allow our movements to be leaderful movements, as opposed to waiting for a singular person who's going to lead us into the future. And as part of that cultural change that's happening in movement spaces, another aspect that people are bringing in is about joy, is about care, is about compassion. And one of the things that I really believe in is how can we make these movements how can we make these cooperatives irresistible? How do we make these sites of joy and connection for members and for communities? And so with that in mind, I think a lot of co-op developers and movement activists are taking that seriously, as opposed to, this is about fighting, this is about winning, this is an aggressive thing that we need to do to take power. And while some of that might be true, we also need to remember that this is our lives and we only get one with each other. And so making these movements and making these co-ops spaces for joy and pleasure is an important aspect to building the cooperative ecosystem and cooperative movement that at least I want to see, and that I see a lot of people wanting to see. Something that I've been told repeatedly is that and that's written in Collective Courage, Jessica Gordon-Nebhart's book, is that so many cooperatives have been started from study groups. And so learning this history was a form of organizing and mobilizing people towards a common agenda, a common goal of building cooperatives, and successful cooperatives, because they were able to learn the lessons. I think anytime I hear somebody who's not in the like core co-op community or like really in it, when I hear from somebody new who's like, oh, I'm so interested in co-ops, and I'm thinking about selling my business to my employees or starting a grocery co-op or something, I always tell them, that's awesome, that's great. Please reach out for support. Here's the organizations that you should contact. Here's some resources, because we have made so many mistakes. You do not need to make those mistakes again.
A lot of those resources were listed by our guest speakers today. If you want to explore them yourself, check out the links in the description. But if you're really hungry for more, CooperationWorks offers a 3-part training called The Art and Science of Co-op Development. It's geared towards people who want to provide meaningful professional assistance to groups starting co-ops.
So Stephen and I want to thank all of our speakers at today's presentations: Bruce Reynolds, Jessica Gordon-Nembhard, Maha Selassie, Sherelle Gardner, and Ricardo Nunez for their informative and passionate takes on cooperative movements. And we also want to thank the funders who have made this video and others in the series possible. That's from the CHS Foundation, Developing Future Ag Leaders, and the Cooperative Development Foundation. Thanks so much.